Scene 1. Let's go.
All right, so we're starting a new series, you could say, within another series that is Exodus that we've been in. Last time we left the Israelites at the foot of Mount Sinai, where God announced a new covenant with the people, and they responded, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." Now, as you may recall, they signed on the dotted lines and agreed to an agreement they had yet to read. They skipped the terms and conditions, you could say, until later, which they'll find out contains 613 laws. And the law takes up basically 2 whole books and part of Exodus, and that's why we're kind of jumping into it right now. Because logically, we went through the tabernacle, and now we're going to go start the law, and we'll cover up all of those passages in a sense. Now, I'm sure we all know the Bible contains laws and precepts of things we should and shouldn't do. Now, how many we are aware of and how many we follow are completely separate subjects. There are many views on how we should look at the law and what should be followed, and many of us probably are aware of the 10 Commandments, or maybe only of what Jesus has said, love God and love your neighbor, for these are the greatest laws, in a sense. Or maybe you want to streamline it and all you need is love, in a sense. That could be your law that you know. So, or maybe you want to, there are many camps out there, though, for how to interpret the law and how to understand it and what to do with it. And that's kind of the question. What are we to do with the law? And so there are many people who pose a question of, well, aren't we under grace, in a sense? We aren't under the law. Isn't it in the Old Testament? Why are we following those things? We're in the New Testament. And so that's one camp of saying, let's just throw out the law completely. Where there's another camp that says, no, we need to follow everything to a T, including the ceremonial laws. Everything must be followed. And so, of course, these are the extreme cases, you could say, the ones that say, let's get rid of it all, or let's keep everything. And so hopefully, we'll look at the law holistically, practically, and above all else, godly, in a sense. So, the first thing is, should we discard the law, in a sense? We'll go with that first side. Are we to discard it? And the easy answer to the problem of the law is simply to get rid of it, right? It only was making me feel bad anyways. But if this is the case, then what do we do about the concepts of good and evil? We're back to evolutionary theory of survival of the fittest. Do whatever feels good and gets you farthest in life at the expense of others. And that's the thing is, what do you do with the concepts of good and evil then? If we get rid of the law, to me when I was thinking about that, it was kind of like you take a math class and you fail. Just like we've all failed the law in a sense, biblically, we've all sinned. But we fail a math class and we're like, well, okay, my solution is to get rid of numbers. I don't like numbers. We're going to solve all my problems that way. But when you do that, how do you exist in society? You look at your bank account, what's there?
Nothing. Actually, wait, no. 37.92.
Yeah, you're right.
But that's what I'm saying. We've gotten rid of numbers because it was making us feel bad. So you look at your bank, it's like, oh, that's so sad. I'm gonna just get rid of it. No numbers. How do you buy things? If you go and buy something, you just say, I like
hard cash.
Yeah. But so that's the thing is, to the people who say, okay, should we disregard it, just get rid of the law completely? It's like saying, let's get rid of numbers, and it's like, all right, it's kind of hard to function in society like that. So, but there are many people who do believe we should get rid of the law partially or even entirely. Within this side of the camp, there are arguments made that Jesus fulfilled the law and we are under grace now, or others that state we only obey which is in the New Testament or post-cross. There are some that even go to that point, but I'm going to stop you right there before anyone has a bad idea that says, oh, that sounds logical. Only New Testament, only post-cross. Because if you follow that out logically, there are certain laws that are missing in the New Testament that are only mentioned in the Old Testament, such as bestiality. That's not mentioned in the New Testament. That one's talked about in the Old Testament. So in the New Testament, yeah, it talks about not eating meats that are strangled and not eating meats that are offered to idols. But bestiality, go right ahead, if that's the logic that we're going to use with only obeying what's in the New Testament. And so with that, we can logically understand that that's a faulty way of believing to understand the law, and so we can't go with that. So now there's another problem, though. If we are to discard the law, you take it conceptually of how Jesus spoke and what he did. Every time he basically spoke, he was quoting the Old Testament and quoting the law. That's how he interacted with the people around him. But then also, what did he do? He followed every single law in the Old Testament. Because if he didn't, then he would have been faulty of sin. And then Jesus would have been a sinner, in which case he couldn't have paid the sacrifice upon the cross, in which case no one would be saved. Our religion would be based off of nothing, in a sense, because it would be a hypocrite who is not a perfect sacrifice. And so that's one issue. If we were to throw away the whole law, we have a problem with Jesus, in a sense, what he said and spoke and how he acted. But then we also have the issue of the concept of the New Testament, of when it was written. If it was written, it wasn't exactly written day one that Jesus died. It was written roughly 30 plus years after. And so the New Testament didn't write any laws for people to follow until after. So what did the new church do at that point? Did they just party until the apostles came by? It's like, all right, we're going to put a stop to this. Here's the new law for us to follow. And so that would be kind of confusing. But also, you'd think that if we're only following what's in the New Testament, then there'd be certain concepts of completely different laws, you could say, within the New Testament that aren't in the Old Testament. But looking at the New Testament, it's very it's a commentation on the Old Testament. It's kind of rehashing. It's taking the concepts in the Old Testament and expanding and explaining it into more modern times within that, into the Greeks and the Hebrews, in a sense, that it was explaining to them. And so it's just rehashing its sermons on the Old Testament. So, but let's kind of keep going with that. Let's go with the verses that people do bring up. A lot of people bring up this verse, Romans 10:4, for Christ is the end of the law. It leads to him, and its purposes is fulfilled in him for granting righteousness to everyone who believes in him. So that's a really, really important verse that a lot of people point to. It's like, oh, it's the end of the law. Well then, there's no law, right? Well, here's another one that people bring up is Galatians says, but if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. There's another peculiar verse that people bring up. It's like, well, that seems pretty straightforward. We're not under the law. We're under the Spirit. You could say we're led by the Spirit. One last one that almost anyone, if you ever have a conversation with someone over the law and what is to be done with it, they'll point to this verse in Hebrews. It says, in that he says, a new covenant he has made, the first obsolete. Now what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. So that's, a lot of people say, oh, the new covenant's here. We're not under the law. We're under the Spirit. The old law, it's gone. It's vanishing away. And that seems pretty straightforward. And so is the whole law to be kept, or maybe only part? And so here's some other verses. Let's see what these verses say on the other side. All scriptures is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of Christ may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto good works. So if we take this verse into account, it says all scriptures. And last time I checked, the book of the law those two books and Exodus that talk about the law are still in the Bible. So that seems pretty straightforward too. All scriptures is for reproof, for correction, for righteousness, instruction. It's for our good. So let's keep reading to another verse. What does Matthew, this is Jesus speaking. It says, "Do not think that I have come to destroy the law or the prophets," which you could take conceptually as the Old Testament. "I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth passes away," which also, I'm still on planet Earth last time I checked, which that's why that's referring to Revelation time, in a sense, till the earth is destroyed. Jesus continues and says, "One jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven." And so this verse is monumental in its statements, yet often overlooked. Jesus is stating, not until the earth is destroyed, not a single law is to be removed, even the smallest of them. One last verse on this side is James 2:24. "You see then that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone." So you having faith is good, but if you don't act upon it in anything, then your faith, as another James passage, is dead in a sense. And so those three verses kind of are on the other side. And so is there a contradiction? That's the question we have. I gave you 3 verses that seemed pretty straightforward. We're done with the law, right? And then I gave you 3 other verses that says, no, the law seems to be very, very important and needs to be used. And so the question is, well, maybe we're missing something. And so I'm going to say is a single verse is not a theology, okay? But the entire Bible is to be taken into account. And a lot of time when people bring up those first 3 verses, that's where they get their entire philosophy. They just say, oh look, this one verse, this 1-2 verse, says this small sentence within the context of the whole chapter. That's what we're going to hold the whole philosophy of what we do with the law with. But that's not a good way to understand the Bible. You need to take the whole Bible in its context, within its verses around it, and with the whole Bible. And so I want to quickly go back to the verses that I used in objection to the law to show how they were actually, I would say, taken out of context. I did that on purpose, but at the same time, those are truly verses people do use to disregard the law completely. So back to the Romans passage. For the Christ is the end of the law for granting righteousness. They don't see that. They don't take point of the word righteousness. And so when I looked at this verse, I went and read the whole chapter. The whole chapter is talking about righteousness and salvation to the Jews, and for the Gentiles, in a sense, is talking about righteousness and that. And so taking it kind of conceptually and breaking it down, I was kind of thinking of this, that I would say we've established that we have to keep the law to a certain amount. So we have to keep some. And since we would not know what is sin if we didn't. So let's look at this chart. Sin brings about death. Okay, we know that because, Adam and Eve, they were perfect beings at the beginning. They were never going to die. But then sin entered the world. They sinned. Death now entered the world. And at that point, God killed an animal for their coverings. And from that point on, sacrifices were now regularly needing to be done. And just a few weeks ago, we were talking about the Israelites and how in the tabernacle, they would have a yearly sacrifice given to, in a sense, atone for the previous year's sin. And they would do it every year. And that's why I have the word temporary. And there would be temporary righteousness because, well, that year is gone. You need to make a new sacrifice. And so Jesus comes and is the perfect and final sacrifice, which makes salvation permanent. And so the verse is really talking about righteousness, in that if anything, it's the end of sacrifices. We're not sacrificing animals anymore. Jesus was the final sacrifice, the perfect sacrifice. And so that's why I would say that that verse previously was taken out of conceptual context, I'd say, of the entire Bible. And the other passage I brought up was Galatians. When I read this one that people would bring up, you just read the verses around it, and you'd understand, oh, okay, you made a little mistake of understanding. And so the verse before says, "For the flesh lusteth against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary to one another, so that ye cannot do the things that ye would. But if ye be led of the Spirit, ye are not under the law. Now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness," and it keeps going on. So within the context of this, I read the verse that people bring up in contradiction to the law, and then I read the surrounding verses. And so the ones before says, okay, here's the flesh. That represents sin, your human nature, and what you want to do that is wrong. But how would you know what's wrong without the law? But then he brings up the Spirit. This is God. This is the Spirit flowing in you, that if you're following that, and that's what he says, if we follow the Spirit, we won't be under the law. But it's referring to we will not be led by the flesh. And then, if you just keep reading, it just gives a list. Here's things you shouldn't do, and here's things you should do, in a sense. And so, the best way I can explain it when I was trying to think about this is, honestly, so at work, for me, we have kind of across the board, no matter where you work within the hub, you have a 1,200 piece per hour that everyone needs to hit, which roughly equates to 20 a minute. Now, some people, they don't hit that, but other people are well above that 20 pieces a minute. And so it's like, I don't have to talk to a single person who's going above and says, hey, you need to pick up the pace. You're not hitting your numbers. That's the law, in a sense, at our company. You need to hit this. But if they're above it, I don't even need to talk to them. But the people below that set number, it's like, hey, you're not hitting these numbers. You're struggling. What do we need to do? And so that's, in a sense, if you're led by the Spirit, you're already above. You're above the law, not in the sense that you're like, you don't have to obey it, but is that you're already obedient. You're already going well above. And that takes into account, too, is later we'll see with one of the verses Jesus talks about with the law, is how what he deals with the law. So another thing, the one verse also with the Hebrews passage that everyone brings up is the new covenant. Well, what is the new covenant? Well, you have to go back to Jeremiah to understand what the new covenant is. And it says, "The days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel. I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people." So this new covenant had nothing to do with disregarding the law whatsoever, but changing its location from tablet or being written to being on their hearts, on their minds. They would know it. So with these going back and forth from whether it is, do we keep it, do we get rid of it, it does seem logical that the law must be applicable in some way. And it seems all of it, almost, too, because we have the verses that say all scriptures. And so you could say for what? And what it is and isn't used for. Like, how do we understand it? So in Hebrews 10:11 it says, "For the law, having a shadow of the good things to come, and not the very image of the things, can never, with these same sacrifices, which they offer continually year by year, making those who approach perfect." So the law is not capable of making us perfect, and obedient to the law cannot cancel out any old sins. Only Jesus is able to rid us of our sins. In John 5:39-40, it says, "You search the scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life. And these are they which testify of me. But you are not willing to come to me," which is referring to Jesus, "that you may have life." So it all points to Jesus, which brings about salvation and nothing else. Everything else is a side effect, you could say, of salvation. And so with these couple verses, you see that the law is not for taking away sins. That's not what the law does. And it's not for being made perfect. The law does not make you, in a sense, a perfect person. You can't find salvation through the law. That is not possible. Only Jesus. So maybe let's see what is the law for then. In Galatians it says, what purpose then does the law serve? It was added because of transgressions till the seed should come to whom the promise was made. Therefore, the law was our tutor to bring us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. So that seems pretty straightforward, to bring us to Christ. And in Deuteronomy it says, and you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble and to test you, knowing what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. So you could say that these laws is to show your heart. You'll know what type of person you are, in a sense, by whether you obey or not, and how you take it. So Matthew 22 says, Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. And so those 613 laws that we mentioned at the very beginning can be put into one of these two categories, you could say. It could be divided. You can even divide it further. In Romans it says, owe no one anything except to love one another, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there is any other commandment, are all summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. And so in a sense, you can boil it all down to love, since you can't lovingly murder someone. You can't lovingly steal from someone. It's just not possible. And so in a sense, if you follow, in a sense, love appropriately, you will and will not do certain things. And so the law is for exposing sins. Shows what is and isn't right. And I would say I put real love, because as I said, you can claim to love someone and kill them, but that's not going to be true. You know, there is, in a sense, an appropriate and inappropriate use of the word love. And so it also finally, the law is for the need for Jesus. The law points directly to Jesus and our need for him for salvation. So that still doesn't really answer how do we apply the law. We still have 613 some odd laws that we don't know what to do with, in a sense, currently. And my simple answer is properly. That is very simple, right? But looking at Matthew, it says, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whomever murders will be in danger of judgment. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of judgment. So what did Jesus do? He took a law and he went to the source. He said, okay, murder, what would cause someone to murder someone? Well, that's clear. You're angry with someone. You hate someone. He puts an asterisk on it. He says without cause, obviously. But he goes to the source, and then he takes that, and he applies it. And that's how you kind of take the law. You look at it, see if you can apply it, and then take it and understand it. Another example is in Corinthians. For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain to keep it from eating the grain. It is only for the oxen that God cares, or does he speak entirely for our sake? Yes, it was written for our sake. The plowman ought to plow in hope, and the thresher to thresh in hope of sharing in the harvest. So, this is where we have so many laws in the Old Testament that you're like, well, I don't got an ox. I don't have animals. Maybe a pet, but it's not working for me, you know? And so you're like, well, what do we do with these laws that don't make any applicable sense to us, right? So you have to understand what the purpose is. And so the ox was being muzzled, putting a little clamp on their mouth while they were working, because the person did not want the ox to eat any of the grain while it was working. But Paul says, no, you shouldn't muzzle the ox because it should be able to eat. It should be able to reap of the benefits of his hard labor also. And so within this context, Paul's saying the same thing as, well, you should pay your workers in a sense. You can't just have slave labor. You gotta pay the person. You gotta pay the pastor, even in a sense. That's kind of the context of the verse. And so that's where we kind of get it. You look at a verse that you might be like, well, this makes no sense. It can't be applied today. But no, you look at the principle. You take the principle and see if it's applicable. Now, if you do have an ox, for some odd reason, sure, don't muzzle it if it's working for you. But that's an interesting thing. It's saying work. And so that's where there's a time or season for all these things. But you try and see if it is applicable. If it isn't, you don't think, try and find the principle and then apply it. And so that's the thing. Take law, find the principle, and apply it. It's as simple as that. And it sounds simple, but it's not so simple because some of them do seem to be strange, like the one of the ox. And so understand the principle, or as many times in sermons you'll hear the spirit of the law and not just letter of the law. And so that is the end of the law, right? Or the lesson. Alright, so you can actually ask questions at this point if you had any.
Do you want me to stop recording?
Yeah.